Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us on the Curbside as we waste a little more time in the garage with Jim Cherry, noted author, illustrator, and columnist for all things automotive, and Tony Barthel, publisher of the Curbside Car Show calendar. Let's head to the garage and see what's going on this week on the Curbside.
Welcome to the Curbside Podcast. This is our very third episode. We're so excited to be here, and we're even more excited that you're here with us. A number of you have clearly told your friends or people you don't like, or whoever it is. Maybe you had a sign out on the street or rented a billboard, but we are seeing people come and spend a little bit of time with myself, and I'm also here, as usual, with my good friend, Mr. Jim Cherry.
That's Senor Jim Cherry to you.
Buenos dias, senor.
Yes. I just enjoyed a plate of huevos rancheros here in sunny Los Angeles, California.
Oh, man, I love huevos rancheros. It's
nothing better. If you ever come here, I will take you to the place that makes the best huevos rancheros in the known universe.
I try to get down there as frequently as I can, and that is exactly what I would appreciate.
Insert sound here.
Yes, we have deemed the device that has taken great minds years to create, the pun alert.
Yes.
I happen to blast you with a pun, and I do so enjoy doing so. Pun alert button has been activated. I would like to take a moment before we start with this week's subject, which is Kustomizers with a K. Wendy DeWitt and Kirk Harwood are the people who have created the music at the beginning and end of the podcast and that you hear under the commercials. And Wendy is the queen of Boogie Woogie. You can find her on the internet, purchase her music, and see her show dates. And boy, when she and Kirk are on stage, they just put on a heck of a show. They're true entertainment, a great piano player, a heck of a vocalist. Kirk is a wonderful drummer, and you'll have a blast if you happen to go to one of their shows. So thank you to Wendy and Kirk for letting us use their original song. This week's subject is something that is truly a visual treat. So you're going to want to visit Curbside and maybe follow along on the website there. But it is Kustomizers, and we're talking Kustomizers with a K. And speaking of K, Jim has the knowledge on this.
Well, Kustom Klassics is the name of the article on the site at curbside.tv under Cherry Classics. And it was a especially favorite one for me to write because living here in Southern California, you really get soaked in that custom culture, which is actually having a huge revival over the last 20 years or so. But to back up a little bit, the origins of this phenomena really got going after World War II when returning veterans, defense plants workers, and restless teens wanted something more exciting to drive than the warmed over models that Detroit was offering. So their ideal came to be a gleaming coupe, smoothed out, stripped naked of trim, and lowered until it nearly scraped the pavement. An ass-dragging sin of a car.
Oh, wow. That's something to see for sure. I'm glad you got to the bottom of that.
Yuck. But a lot of these veterans and civilians who'd worked during the war in defense plants had developed mad skills in metalworking, machining, engineering skills. They applied all those to their cars and reinvented a whole culture of custom cars. And it was soon spelled with a K by such famous practitioners as George Barris, who became a superstar. He was a very skillful promoter of himself, and he kind of took over as the main man in custom cars for a while. There was a lot of smaller, lesser-known guys doing the same thing. Along with George, I'd have to say in the pantheon were guys like Gene Winfield, Darryl Starbird. There were so many who followed up with the same traditions. Bill Cushenberry was another one, and Dean Jeffries of North Hollywood. These guys were all contributing to that cultural stream of making their own version of the perfect car.
Well, there was also Ed Big Daddy Roth. He also made quite the name for himself with some of his customs.
I'm glad you brought that up, Tony. He stands apart, really. Ed Big Daddy Roth really didn't do customs, interestingly enough, because technically a custom is a standard car that has been modified to the wishes of the owner stylistically. Ed Roth would build his cars from scratch. He'd go to the junkyard and scrounge up all the mechanical bits he needed and create an all-new fiberglass body for it, put a bubble top on it, get the upholstery done, and he'd create really what was in essence an art car. They didn't actually drive, most of them. They couldn't be driven. They were just a piece of art. So they were kind of a hybrid between a Detroit concept car and a custom car. They were somewhere in between, but they were pure art. There's no way around it.
But did Ed not have influence, sort of a hand in some of the modified street cars at all, or?
Oh, I'm sure people were picking up bits from here and there, but his stuff was so out there and so original, it was kind of hard to adapt many of its, their innovations to standard cars. I would say people like George Barris or some of these other more pure customizers would have had more influence, like maybe Gene Winfield too, whereas they would take a standard car and modify it to their look rather than building it from scratch. It is interesting you bring up the Detroit thing, because I'm going to talk about it. These customizers and their approach to modifying Detroit cars began to get the notice of the designers in Detroit. They were reading the magazines and seeing what these guys were doing, and they started flying those guys back to Detroit to talk to them and visiting their studios. More than a little bit of crossbreeding between what the customizers were doing and what Detroit ended up doing. For instance, if you'll notice, the chromed up 1950s cars that we all love started to go away by the mid-60s. They were all clean-sided and sculptural, and it was more about the shapes of the body than all the decorations you put on it. That was a direct influence of what the custom culture guys did with what they called shaving off the chrome.
And I think our eyes are a little bit better for it, although some of the chrome in the 50s cars almost outweighed some of a modern car.
Well, yeah, they were pretty heavy duty, but we love that jewelry now. It's fun, and those cars are great. We like to collect them and see them at shows or whatever, but back then, Detroit kept marching on. The whole thing was planned obsolescence. They needed the next year's car to look different than last year's. And if the trend was all chrome decorations for a few years, they needed to go another direction. So they started cleaning things up in the 60s, and that was a big change. It was partly influenced by the customizers.
One of the customizers, as you had said, was George Barris, who was also very, very good at getting his name out there. You actually wrote a chapter in the book about Barris.
Thank you, Tony, for pointing that out. That book is called The Art of George Barris. I had to go look at my bookshelf over there. I wrote the chapter on the 1960s to the present day for that book, and it was great because I got to meet and interview George for the book, go through his history and documents and put together a little history on him. He was a very interesting guy. He ended up actually working directly for Detroit in the later days of the big concept car extravaganza of the mid-century. In the 1960s, Ford started hiring customizers to do some of their show cars, and George did a few of those for them.
Any that we could see today? Do you know if any of those have been preserved?
I'm not sure as far as state of preservation. That's a very good question. Another thing I find really fascinating about these customizers was as the trend continued and they realized they needed to make a name for themselves to get more business, they made their names by their appearances in the proliferation of custom car magazines back then and the shows that would feature these cars. So they found that the best way to get that publicity was to do a complete ground-up new creation of a car like Big Daddy Roth was doing, and that would dazzle the show crowds and also get coverage on the covers of these magazines. So you have guys like Darryl Starbird doing bubble-topped redos of an old Thunderbird with a TV set in the dash and really wild interiors. George Barris did some crazy stuff. Bill Cushenberry did. Gene Jeffries did the Manta Ray, which was a single-seater bubble top. Gene Winfield did another car that was featured all over TV. So they got into the actual building of concept cars that were very similar in a lot of ways to what Detroit was doing, with all those crazy Motorama concept cars and the Virgil Exner dream cars. So there was some streams that came together. So the customizers influenced Detroit at the same time Detroit was influencing the customizers.
Those bubble tops, it's funny, last week we talked about the GM Futureliners and their Parade of Progress. The original Futureliners had a bubble top. You would think they'd learn from that, because I wonder just if you're in one of those customs and it has that bubble top and it's Southern California on a nice hot day, you bring your turkey and you can roast it right there in the passenger seat.
Yes, Tony, but you're talking about practicalities, and bottom line is almost nobody nobody ever drove these cars on the street.
No.
It was never heard of. They were art. They were like a fantasy vision of what a car could be. And practicalities of like bubble tops being a situation of overheating the occupants never even occurred to them. And it didn't matter. For instance, Big Daddy Roth's famous Beatnik Bandit custom hot rod with a bubble top. The bubble top was so low that you couldn't sit in the car. Your head would be smashed against the roof. I've only seen one picture of people inside that car, and it's what looks like two petite models, and they're scrunched in there. They can't even sit up properly. The car, actually, you couldn't sit in the car. It didn't run. It wasn't a car. It was a piece of art.
Yeah, but it was a cool piece of art. And one of the things, if you were a teenager or a young lad at that point, all the model companies made models of these cars, and you could take one right home and build it yourself. And I know I built more than a few models, unfortunately, most of which ended up exploding with M80s. But that's another story for another day.
Yes, we've all had some of those experiences. I personally like to burn them with a match and watch the plastic melt. I was more of a slow motion guy.
Oh, man.
But be that as it may, interesting you bring up the model cars, because those were a huge phenomena back then. People like Big Daddy Roth, he actually stated his primary source of income during the prime of those models was his income from royalties on those model kits. They would literally sell millions of copies of some of those car models. And so it was a huge phenomena in the culture that came to a screeching halt because of the most out there, bizarre reason. You would never guess. Why did the whole model kit building of the crazy hot rods, why did that come to a halt? What would be your guess?
Shortage of M80s?
Meh. I think that's not going to qualify. No, actually, Big Daddy Roth put his finger on it. He said he'd actually completed his last bubble top custom called the Orbitron. And as was the custom, he took it over to Revell in Venice, California. They did all their photographing the actual car and measuring everything and getting it all together for engineering as a model kit. And the model kit never came out, because between the time of him showing up at Revell with that car to be measured and the time they were going to start making the plastic molds, something happened on television. The Beatles appeared on Ed Sullivan.
Bum, bum, bum.
More like, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
But anyway, the thing was, what Big Daddy Roth says, he says, as soon as that happened, all the kids quit buying model kits and immediately started buying records and guitars. And he said it happened overnight.
It's interesting to think of the complete change like that affecting an industry. You know, here you're galloping along, building all these cool model cars. And I remember Revell of Venice, California. Growing up in Southern California, you could actually go there for a tour.
Wow.
It's funny to think, you know, here you are, you have this great successful business and a musical group comes along and just completely wipes it out.
Yeah, he said it was just like dramatic. And Revell never even put the Orbitron into production because the sales dropped so precipitously that there was no future in producing that car model. It's really interesting. But back to our subject of custom cars and the custom kings. What's the state of the art right now, Tony?
Well, it looks like people are starting to collect these cars. People have interest in them again.
Yeah, they do. There, of course, is a huge resurgence in people going back into the hobby and creating these custom cars again. And some of them even do it to the standards of the old 1950s builders. But there's also, going along with that, a great interest in the old classics of the mid-century period custom cars. For instance, as we speak, someone is restoring George Barris's Golden Sahara dream car, which was one of his greatest. That car appeared in Cinderfella, starring Jerry Lewis, and that's being rebuilt. His a la carte, which was a model kit I actually built back in the day, that was restored several years ago. So a lot of these cars are being brought back out of the dusty barns and put back out on the show circuit now.
We are lucky for whoever owns barns, because when you think about the stuff people have put away, even in its incredible state of disrepair and whatnot, and years later someone sees scraps of an old car and has the inspiration to put it back either on the street or in the show scene or wherever it ends up. I'm very grateful for those guys, because there's some cool stuff that you just wonder, it's like, God, where did how do you have the vision of taking those scraps and turning it back into what it originally once was?
Thank you, Tony, because you just promoted our upcoming podcast, Barn finds.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, we have a very special guest for that, and we will tell you more as that door opens up.
As that develops, too.
Indeed. Yeah, like film. Something
Yes.
nobody else sees either, like these model kits. Now, George Barris, as you said, again, self-promoter, also quite the customizer with the K. He gained a lot of notoriety with television cars, and he created the car for Batman, the Batmobile, which when I was a kid, that was my favorite. It could shoot rockets out of the pipes in the trunk and do all sorts of cool stuff. And then also the Munsters cars.
Yes, Dragula and the Munsters coach were both done by him, along with the Raiders, Paul Revere and the Raiders. He did a coach for them. He was all over TV. He did custom cars for Sonny and Cher, for Dean Martin. All these different people, Hollywood stars, would come to him and have their cars made a little bit more special with the Barris touch. But of course, the most famous one of all is the Batmobile, which was, of course, based on the 1955 Lincoln Futura concept car.
Yeah, it's truly a favorite of mine. And somewhere I still have my Corgi Batmobile from when I was a kid.
Yeah, kids everywhere loved that car and still do. Interestingly enough, George Barris was not the first choice to create that Batmobile. Originally, Dean Jeffries of North Hollywood was hired to do the car by Paramount, and he got to work on it, and something happened where there was a speed up in the production schedule or something, and he said he wouldn't have time to complete it on their schedule. He was starting from a 1959 Cadillac convertible. That was what
that would have been cool.
That could have been a cool Batmobile too. But anyway, so he had to cancel the contract, and they were desperate then. They had like 3 weeks or something. They needed the car, and they went to George Barris, and he said, I can do it. He had on his lot at the shop, he had the Lincoln Futura, which was kind of broken down and decaying without any love at all, sitting outdoors for many years. But he drug it in the shop and converted that into the historic Batmobile that everybody loves today.
Yeah, and we're the better for it.
Well, there's a controversy about that. A lot of the traditionalists and the concept car fans are horrified that car was ever modified into the Batmobile, and some of them even have a fantasy that it could be restored back to the original dream car, which is kind of crazy if you ask me.
Yeah, and first you're going to have to buy back that Batmobile, and I think that thing sold for like $12 million or some crazy figure like that.
It was actually around $4 million. But
was
still
that
pretty.
all?
That's all for you. You should have bought it.
Oh my God, I'm going to go get my checkbook. Well, any last thoughts, Jim, on where this has come from and where it's heading?
Well, I don't know enough to predict any future for the custom car hobby, but it's really healthy right now, and it's great to see the old custom classics like the Golden Sahara being restored and put back on the show circuit. I would like to salute the guys that are still out there doing it. Unfortunately, we lost George Barris a few years back, but Gene Winfield is still building cars, and so is Darryl Starbird. Darryl is out in Kansas. He's not a SoCal guy, but he's one of the best, if you ask me. And some of his cars are still gorgeous custom classics that look great today.
I'd love to see that. And perhaps we could also convince him to come join us one of these days on the Curbside podcast.
That's possible. I've had some correspondence with Mr. Starbird, and he seemed very friendly and affable and cooperative, so it's possible we could feature him on here. But I did want to point out that his Predicta, with its bubble top and TV set in the dash, was as good as anything coming out of the Detroit dream car factories at the time. Detroit would spend the equivalent of like $1 million in today's money to build a car, and Darryl Starbird would do it out of junkyard parts with his own sweat and his own spray gun, and it would compete with those guys. So I think it's pretty impressive what the custom kings used to do.
Yeah, they brought a lot of talent. And again, as you had mentioned, it came out of the aircraft industry of World War II. So it had this tremendous training and all this talent and skill, and turned into some great sheet metal right on the road.
That's right, Tony. Thank you so much for tuning in today to the Kustom Classics version of our podcast. We look forward to seeing you next week right here.
Don't forget, you can find the Curbside podcast parked in the garage at iTunes or your favorite podcatcher program. And don't forget to write a review so that other people can find us as well. We sincerely appreciate it, and we hope that they will too. You can find notes, information, the articles, pictures, and more at www.curbside.tv. Have a great week. We'll see you next time, and thank you for spending your time with us on the Curbside.
Thank you for joining us this week, and now go get something productive done. That honey-do list isn't getting any shorter.